was something new.
So when you sat down to write the Batman script, were you already comfortable with writing camp and tongue-in-cheek sorts of things before? Or was this the first time?
Well, see, both the plays that I'd done, which were earlier, Golden Fleecing, which was made, The Honeymoon Machine was the title that they made at Metro under, with Steve McQueen. And it was a broad comedy. So, I mean, I was tempted towards that. And Night in Samarkand was also essentially a comedy, a romantic comedy. So my mind was always towards that. And I have to say, in all honesty, that this, and later on when I was on the board of the Guild for several terms, in my experience, the comedy writers were incredibly smarter than the serious episodic writers. More fun to be with, they're better people. And I'm sorry, but I always felt that serious episodic television writing tended towards, the sententious and the highly predictable good thoughts, which, and I never, ever would write anything like that, just by temperament. And so in Batman, the style and the storytelling seemed to come out of it very naturally to me, out of the humor of it. And again, the show was, the show has been enormously influential on other comedy writers. My daughter's partner is a guy called George Myers, who's been the soul of The Simpsons writing since the beginning of it. And so he and Maria, my daughter, know all the comedy writers around. And I can't tell you how often, I mean, it's weird, but they literally revere me, when they discover that Maria's my daughter, and they say, can I meet your father? And the other show, Get Smart, was the other show that they greatly admired in that, more or less that period, as being very sophisticated. Buck Henry's show as being very sophisticated, and several of them, more than one has said, I decided to become a comedy writer when I was seeing Batman as a kid.
But you weren't known at the time you wrote Batman as a comedy writer, were you?
No.
Doing Rat Patrol on the road.
Yeah, I wasn't really known. These things were so freelance, and I said they almost all came from some acquaintance I had with the producer or the director or something. But with Batman, as I say, in the pilot, they shot the pilot.
Before we get to the shooting, in the script, was the script as colorful as the pilot? Did you have the bang, biff, all that in the set? Was in your description saying that will be on screen?
Yes.
As well as describing the Batcave and the Batmobile, all the things that become iconic. Were they established right there in the script?
They all were there in the first script. So
wasn't that sort of over-directing for you? I mean, did you go into more detail in that script than you ordinarily would have?
Not really. I mean, I just described. I really didn't know. I mean, it was also. In other words, Wayne Manor was a classic millionaire's mansion. That's all I said. The classic stereotypical millionaire's country mansion, and so it didn't require anything. And the Batcave, I just said filled with gadgets, and and again, it wasn't. It was my thing. All these things calling, bat ropes and bat this and bat everything, and all those things. So I said it's got all these, like in the theatrical film of Batman made later, which I'll mention. I mean, there Batman and Robin are on a rope ladder from a helicopter, and a shark jumps up and fastens on the Batman's leg. He jumps out of the water. A sensationally phony shark, needless to say. And Batman says, "Quick, Robin, the bat shark repellent." And so they took so Robin pulls out of his belt, said, "Here, Robin, here, Batman." And Batman, says, "Thank heavens you had it with you, the bat shark repellent." But I mean, these kind of things were in the script, as I say, and it didn't require detailed explanation because Bill understood it. Bill understood totally.
But the witty lines everyone loves, but the equally as memorable is the colorful and distinct production design of the show. And I was just wondering how much of that was in the script that inspired that.
A reasonable. I don't. No. It was enough was in the script. Of course, the color design was wonderful, and Adam was perfect. Adam West. ideal casting. And Burt was ideal casting, too.
We'll get into the casting in a moment. When you were in Spain, you wrote this pilot script, and you had this meeting in New York, you were aware now that you were committing yourself to something far more than just freelance scripts. Weren't you? That you knew that now, unlike before where you were freelancing for different shows, now you were investing in something. Did that require a change of heart or a...
No, it didn't require. Again, it's hard to believe. I didn't even think of that, really, to tell you the truth. I just hoped it would get on, you know?
But in this case, you would have had a royalty. You took care of yourself in that regard.
Not really, no. If anything I would be bitter about, it would be Batman. I'm not. But I had a remarkably bad deal. I was executive story editor for the build, and I think I got a couple of $100 each show.
So what that meant at the time, even though you were living in Spain, is that you would, I assume, write as many scripts as you wanted, but you would also be assigning and rewriting all the scripts that came in.
That came up after it got on the air, really. You know, there was no structure. There was no organized structure in television those days, at least in Batman. I suppose the big comedy shows like Lucy and these long-running famous shows had a strong structure. This one didn't. It was really just Bill and his assistant, Charlie Fitzsimons, producing it. And I don't even remember who the art director was, but the idea was I didn't have to say it in the script, that it was done in sharp, pastel, bright comic book colors. I mean, that's the way it was done. And I don't mean to take any credit away from the person who designed it, but it went with the territory to me, basically. And the costume, it all went with the territory. And so it all was, I really think that it was in the script. I don't mean because it was in word by word. Once you read the script, and if you got it, you couldn't do it any other way.
When you pitched the show to ABC after the pilot script, was there any concern on their part or yours that the joke might run out, that it might not sustain, that it would be difficult to do week after week, that same level of humor and satire? I
don't think they did. In fact, it did prove extremely hard to do. And the show was amazingly short-lived for its success. You know, it ran out and hardly got through a second season for one of the great all-time hits. And anyway, let's go back to it anyway. The show, the director was also director Robert Butler.
When did he get involved in the process?
Bill hired him. I wasn't there. But Bill was a very good friend of mine. Nothing to do with work. He and my wife went to UCLA together, and, you know, we definitely were friends. And I was delighted when I heard he was doing it, because he was a reasonably noted television director. That was before he did those Street Blues and things like that. He did a lot of pilots afterwards. But Bill was perfect. Bob was the perfect person to get involved in it, and he did a very good job. But I say, again, I was in Spain without a phone or anything. And I got occasional, occasional cables from Bill. You know, every few days, just get a cable, terrific, great, everybody loves it, you know, blah, blah.
There was no pressure on you to get on a plane and move back to LA?
That came a little later.
Yeah. But at this point, so you would get a cable saying, we've cast Adam West, we've cast Burt Ward, we've cast...
That names meant nothing to me. Say, we've got a cast, we think it's great. You know, and we're shooting it, you know, and I wasn't saying ABC decided to shoot it without a pilot, schedule it without a pilot. That's the really exciting thing. In other words, it's going to be on the air on, I guess it was Thursday night. Wednesday and Thursday, or Tuesday and Wednesday.
So they already decided right from the start to be twice a week.
They had decided it would be twice a week with a cliffhanger. That was a big chance on their part. I mean, much more than that showed, to me, substantial confidence in it.
And how did you feel about that? Because that had never been done before, doing a show twice a week. The first half would end with a cliffhanger.
But again, so superficial was my involvement with television. I mean, it hadn't been done before, but I didn't consider it much so interesting. I thought it was very daring and strained the audiences, despite these absurd cliffhangers that we always wrote in at the end of the first one. And Bill Dozier narrated it all, as you know. Mm-hmm. He loved doing that.
But you weren't, you'd written the pilot, they order now, we're going to do a series, 2 a week, 1 with a cliffhanger. It now falls on you to write this. How did you deal with that? Were you excited? Were you nervous?
No. I'm sorry to say, again, I'm being dull here, but I wasn't any of these things. It was fun to write. Now, the cliffhangers is nothing easier to write if you don't have to figure out how to get people out of them. I mean, after they were all cheats. That's the wonderful part. In movies, I mean, terrible things. You can have people chased and cornered. Now, how do they get out of this? Semi-plausibly. In Batman, it would just be they'd come up with some incredible gadget at the beginning of the second one, and the thing would go away.
So Robert Butler's hired to be the director. They're casting without you, just sending cables saying, we've got Adam West, we've got Burt Ward. You're saying terrific. We've got Nelson Riddle doing the music. At what point did someone say, Lorenzo, we have to work out something about your involvement? Are you going to write the episodes? Are you going to interview the screenwriters?
Yeah.
When did that start coming into play?
It's hard for me to remember. It was not. It should have been an issue in my mind, but it wasn't. Mm-hmm. I knew I couldn't write them all. I mean, for 2 weeks was obviously absurd. I mean, two scripts a week, and so then it was agreed that I was going to be executive story editor, which meant rewriting, polishing, stuff like that. And the first couple of scripts, I say they mailed me. Bill mailed me. We did it by.
So you had nothing to do with hiring the writers or picking the writers?
At this stage, no. But I've not picking writers because I was still in Spain, and maybe 1 or 2 writers Bill had talked to and whatnot. And there were a couple that it was hard to find writers. I'll get to that in a moment. Who understood the really quite unique comedy of the show. I mean, I wrote bat notes, which would be what you'd call a volume, would be what you'd call the Bible these days. And I gave examples of what Batman would do and what he wouldn't do. And those were given to, and pretty religiously followed, at least at the beginning of the show for the rest of the first year and into the second. But anyway, so then they said, you have to come back. This is not going to, Then it's gone on and become a huge hit.
Well, before it becomes a huge hit, let's back up. They said they're going to put the show on the air. You're going to be the executive story editor. You'll be rewriting scripts. We've hired some writers. Did you feel a possessiveness over the scripts and the stories? So when you got those first freelance scripts, did you kind of cringe when you saw them? Or so you're in a brand new position. Instead of being on one side of the desk, you are now on the other side for the first time.
I cringed slightly, but not just they weren't mine, that's all. I mean, it was just purely, I felt I understood it better than anybody else could, and that was an exaggeration, but again, I knew it had to be. And it really, I keep saying over and over that I wasn't that committed to this. I've never taken the whole business seriously enough. And about my deal or anything, although I should have had a better deal. Because I was paid a small amount on a week. I mean, as a story editor, as executive story editor. Maybe $500 a show or something like that. But I mean, nothing like they're talking about these days. So
you're in Spain, the show's in production, they've got their cast. And you're going through the scripts, obviously long before it's aired, so you don't know what the public reaction will be. How was it?
I don't think I got scripts until it was aired. I must have. Yeah, I must have. Yes, I must have.
So were you getting? I guess long before video cassettes, you weren't seeing any dailies, were you?
Oh no.
So you had no idea how Adam West and those actors were portraying your.
No, I'm
camp.
sure. They said, everybody said it sounded perfect.
So you were writing in the dark, in a sense.
Yes. Writing in the dark, yes, to that extent. That's what made it, as I say, that's a freedom that television writers don't have. Very few writers have these days.
But the dark, also in terms of not knowing how your words are being performed, you weren't getting any footage to look at.
No, but that's, I understand that is the director's job, how it's being performed.
When did you finally see an episode of Batman? How long into the process before you saw the pilot? Or the first episode, rather?
It was several months.
Oh, wow.
Because, anyway, they started saying that Bill said, you got to come home. You got to come back. And I was reluctant. And I said, I'll come back as far as Westport in Connecticut. I won't come to California. So
why were you so reluctant even to visit California?
I wasn't especially. I just liked the idea of being independent. And, I should have come over to receive glory and all the things like that.
So even before the show aired, how were they able to attract such big-name guest stars before the show even became a sensation?
I don't know. Just, again, people saw the script. It took 5 minutes of their time. I think it was probably after the first one I don't know. Again, I wasn't there. to get those cameos to see on bat climbs and things, as you know, it quickly became the thing to do for stars to do. But the first one or so, I think they just got, I don't know, Bill was he'd run 2 studios earlier, RKO and another studio, with mixed results, which is why he was now peddling television pilots. But he knew these people. You know, he could call up whoever and say, hey, come on, do me a favor, appear this, it'll be fun.
So how much interaction did you have during this period while you were in Spain and later Westport with the producers? How much influence did they have over the writing of the scripts and how the show was? None.
At that time, no. As I say, I never had the 4 scripts I wrote, I think they were shot. If there were any changes, I don't remember them. You know, maybe Bob made a couple of changes because of to do with the production, to do with the sets or things. But I never got a script back to rewrite, ever.
Do you remember the first time you saw Batman?
Yeah, I thought it was great. It was really, I'd read enough about it by then.
So when you finally saw it, it had already been a sensation on the air, and you never saw it in advance of its broadcast?
No.
So were you, I'm trying to imagine what this was like for you. You are totally insulated yourself from the actual production, hadn't seen rushes or anything, hadn't even seen the show, but you were now hearing about the tremendous appeal of the program.
Yes.
What was that like for you?
Very satisfying.
But we weren't baffled having not seen it yet?
No, I wasn't baffled particularly. No, I mean, I was surprised, pleasantly surprised, especially by the fact, I mean, there was 1 week or 2 weeks when it was number 1 and number 2, actually. I mean, both halves. Number 2 fell off particularly, but I mean, it was number 1 several times. I mean, of all television shows, the first one. And it was particularly fun because, you know, a lot of people, some of the early reviews, they thought it was just a horrible show. They thought we were trying to make a serious show. And unsophisticated people said, this is just unbelievable claptrap, which I'd read those things. I kind of liked, you know, I thought it might hurt the show's success, but it didn't. It didn't, because, you know, and again, a lot of people were very young that saw it then and had no, I think were totally unconscious of the camp, to tell you the truth.
I know I was when I was a kid. I watched it thinking it was straight.
That's what I mean.
Until I became an adult, or teenager.
That's right.
But when you watched that first time, and you saw Adam West, you saw Burt Ward, tell me about your reaction and how you felt about the actors playing the parts and the look of the show. I
thought they were wonderful. I mean, Adam was Batman. And in fact, in life, he was Batman. He is Batman. He's an extremely sweet guy. And at the height of his success, I mean, I was told when he was being mobbed in the street, you know, literally recognized in people, crowds. He always gave autographs very nicely, and he never had a swelled head at all, which is amazing.
And what about Burt Ward?
Burt Ward was more problematic. I mean, he was perfect, as he had the same person. You know, he was sort of annoying, always around and yammering, but, you know, putting his oar in. And in fact, Bill had to, a couple of times, threatened to write him out. And they would say Lorenzo's doing a script in which you get killed. It's just, I never did one, but to keep him in line, he was reminded that he was expendable.
Did the actors, Burt Ward or Adam West, ever contact you directly about scripts or about their characters?
No. Adam was a tremendous fan, and as always, you know, excessively so. And, you know, I did put him in one movie later that I wrote.
What about Alan Napier? What was...
He was, you know, again, I have no personal anecdotes about these people. I wasn't there, and Alan Napier is a wonderful stage actor.
What about, for instance, you had three different Catwomen? Julie Newmar and
yes.
Lee Meriwether and Eartha Kitt. What was your impression about the comparing and contrasting the three of them?
I had no impression at all. I mean, the Eartha Kitt was the most obvious one. Mm-hmm. I mean, as being a Catwoman, her manner. It didn't make... it's hard to say, but I really wasn't that involved.
Well, were you ever asked to write, I imagine you were with Liberace in particular, but to craft episodes for particular big-name guest stars?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that was later. I wrote the first four. Mm-hmm. I never actually wrote one after that. The best money I've gotten is on the residuals, just the ordinary residuals of half-hour episodes. And I always wished that I had said I would like $5 every time a Batman episode is shown anywhere. I'm sure they would have agreed to it gleefully. And then I would have made a fortune because, it's been played all over. And
do you remember much about some of the individual episodes, like Fine Feathered Finks and...
No.
Nope.
I have to look at them again. I just remember, that was Penguin. And Penguin, of course, again, I knew Buzz Meredith socially and from New York. And so, he was perfect. All these actors, as you know, they really had second careers out of this. Mm-hmm. And they loved him because they were so silly. Burgess Meredith was a very serious actor in New York. And he loved, being the Penguin. And, and I had some of the best lines, I thought, if not his lines. There were a lot of them, but there was a line about him I always liked particularly when this actually was in the theatrical movie we'll get to in a moment, made from the series. And there's reason to believe, Batman has reason to believe from solving some riddle or something, that Penguin and all the other group are in a submarine from which they plan to blow up to UN headquarters in the East River. And so Batman phones the Secretary of the Navy. And, he says, Mr. Secretary, this is Batman. He says, oh, good to talk to you. Good to hear from you, Batman. And he says, there's something suspicious going on. Do you have any reason? Have you sold any submarines lately? And he says, just a moment, let me look it up. Why, yes, we did recently sell a submarine. It's curious you ask. And Batman says, may I ask who you sold it to? And he said, a Mr. P.N. Gwynn. And I said, what was his address? He said, Secretary said, he just gave us a post office box number. And Batman says, don't you consider it very irresponsible, Mr. Secretary, to sell submarines to people who only leave a post office box? And that was the kind of thing, you know. And Buzz Meredith played up to that perfectly as Penguin. He loved cackling and, and I said the show was over the top. It got more over the top. Which I think is one of the reasons for its demise.
But that was your call, wasn't it, being the writer and story editor?
To some extent. The idea was, in other words, Liberace, that was not my idea. Somebody said, of course it was written for Liberace. Each one was written when they had these, Mr. Freeze that Otto Preminger played. Uh-huh. And that was, again, that Mr. Freeze, it was a character, I believe, in comic book, in the series. But they were written by other people around those, but they got too wild.
But you were still in charge of the writing, regardless of who wrote them, right?
I was still in charge of the writing.
And whether
I wanted to do as little as possible.
Whether it was Eli Wallach or Otto Preminger or George Saunders who played Mr. Freeze, you would write it the same way?
Yes. See, I never wrote a Mr. Freeze script myself. I just, so we had trouble finding writers. Mm-hmm. I always consider, I like these lines that I have, to my self-congratulation, quoted in this interview. The lines had a very delicate balance, of deadpan, without being too silly. I mean, they were deadly serious inside their context. And other people would start writing jokes, which the humor was from the exchange, not a one-liner joke. Mm-hmm. And actually, when I was working on The Golden Fleecing play with Abe Burrows up in Provincetown, he once said to me, he said, Lorenzo, you're never going to be a successful comedy writer. It was interesting. He said, the reason, you write smilers. They're death. And there's nobody more experienced than him. He said, you've got to have a punchline, that the joke must be constructed. You can't, in other words, you write a lot of stuff that's amusing and people smile all the time. But that's not how comedy works. And that probably, that might be true, because I never have written a comedy with big jokes where people are meant to roll on the floor. And there were some of them in Golden Fleecing, and they weren't that successful. And they were partly Abe's as well.
So were people adding jokes after you wrote the scripts, or were the actors ad-libbing on the set?
I don't think they were. I wasn't there. I don't think they were. Although, again, they did not have powerful directors. Mm-hmm. I mean, they never had Elia Kazan in to direct an episode or anything. It was actors, and their incredible vanity, and they loved to see themselves doing anything weird. I mean, I've always felt when they say, isn't an actor brave to do something that makes a fool of himself? I say, that's the easiest thing to do in the world. You know, as long as he's established as something else. When Brad Pitt clowns in the current Coen Brothers movie, Burn After Reading, you know, he plays a clowning idiot. They say, isn't that brave of Brad Pitt? I say, give me a break. He's Brad Pitt. That's what makes it funny, and that's so they know it.
So, the Batman theme, the Batmobile, and all that. What was your reaction to seeing them?
They were terrific. Actually, Chuck Barris, who made the Batmobile out in the Valley, he had the best deal on the whole. He made more money, I think, than anybody else on Batman, top to bottom, because he never sold us the Batmobile. We had to rent it for each show. Mm-hmm. And he also owned it to show around it, you know, when the shows went around to fairs and things and showed the Batmobile. But I thought it was wonderful. You know, it was an old junker of some kind. I've forgotten, a DeSoto or something.
So you talked earlier about the Bat rules for writers.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the Bat rules?
I wish I had a copy. But I mean, I tried to describe just the things that I've been saying here. I gave sample lines. And I said, Batman never broke the law. It was important. Only one person was ever killed in all of Batman. Only one person ever injured, even. And that was, again, Jill St. John, in the first episode, fell into a nuclear reactor. She was pushed into a nuclear reactor. And that was the end of Jill. And she was vaporized. But after that, decided, don't kill anybody. I mean, there's no gunplay in it at all, anywhere, ever. He wasn't that kind of guy.
But did you talk in the Bat rules about what you're talking about now, the kinds of humor that were acceptable for Batman?
I described it as best I could. I gave examples of things that were right. And there were times when they were rushing to catch somebody. And there's a no parking zone, you know. And Robin would say, stop here, you know, stop here, we got him. And Batman would say, no, we must never break the law, Robin. And wouldn't park there because there was a no parking sign. And I gave that as an example of the kind of things that Batman did, that he was incredibly square, totally square. I mean, that really is the essence of it, and not to try to make him witty. In fact, the more serious and if he could knit his brows and come up with a ridiculous solution to a riddle, that was the better. I don't say the dumber he seemed the better, but the more somber and straight and profoundly silly, but not a jokester.
Now let's talk a little about your own Bat tips in a way for writers. When you were doing the episodes, did you have to send an outline to the network or the studio for approval, or did you have free reign?
Never.
And what about for yourself? Did you write outlines?
Never.
So what's your writing process when you sit down to write a Batman or anything else?
Well, Batman was different, you know. Batman, I remember I only actually wrote 4 of them myself. Mm-hmm. And the process was to think of what the gimmick was. In other words, along the way, at some point, they were going to kidnap Batman or Robin or both. Mm-hmm. And also to be threatened. There was a perpetual thing. Again, it's never really clear why, but the biggest threat was that he would be unveiled as Bruce Wayne, millionaire. I don't know why, actually. If you think of it logically, why it would have made any difference at all. But I guess they could have come and killed Bruce Wayne. But there was always a time when he was threatened with exposure. And as I say, Commissioner Gordon, who was the only person, again, unbelievably square, who was in on the thing, you know, it was constantly, only Batman can save us, you know, this was talking about the city. And, you know, so turn on the bat signal. I loved that. That was in the comic book. Projects a bat on the clouds. But but I would just think of the gimmick and then try to write, I thought, funny stuff.
And you say you only wrote 4 original scripts, but weren't you also rewriting the freelance scripts that came out?
I rewrote the first ones considerably, yes. Mm-hmm. But just to make them conform to what I've just said, to what was in the Bat rules.
Do you have a favorite episode of your own? Or
No.
What about a favorite villain?
I don't really. They all were wonderful. I mean, the first 4 were wonderful. I didn't like any of the star phony villains as much. Any of them. Mr. King Tut. Do you remember that was one?
And Egghead.
Egghead was kind of fun. But again, I actually, strangely, despite my saying I wasn't that taken with Batman as the comic thing, I consider myself a purist, basic about it. I mean, when the villains became too bizarre and possibly bigger than Batman, I didn't like it.
We had Queen Nefertiti, Mr. Freeze, Mad Hatter, False Face, Bookworm, the Minstrel, the Clock King, just to name a few. Okie Annie. And you got to work with David Wayne again, or I guess you didn't because you were in Spain, but wasn't he in your play? And he also played the Mad Hatter in Batman?
He played Mad Hatter, yes. Yes.
So you talked a bit about the phenomenon of Batman. What was it like to be in the middle of that? Here you've created a show that breaks all the rules, airs twice a week, and overnight becomes this sensation with kids and adults alike. Tell me what that experience was like for you, even in being in Spain or Westport.
Well, it was very satisfying, as I said. But again, when I say it is insane these days, if I'd been with a big agency or something, had a good agent, I presumably could have parlayed that into a very good overall deal of some kind. I never did at all, and there was no talk about it even. You know, I didn't look ahead at all. Mm-hmm. I still, in those days, the idea was to get it to features. I think Batman was the best thing I ever wrote, including, noted movies. Excuse me a second, I've got to... But Batman was the most satisfying, whole thing. As a whole work that came out the way that I wanted it. And so for that reason, I was very excited. And again, I went down, when we were in Westport, I went down to a wine tasting in Princeton. Fancy wine tasting, benefit, money raising. And when people found out that I wrote Batman, I mean, they mobbed me to get autographs and everything. I was astounded, but I mean, that's the way it was.
But you did eventually exploit it to a degree. I mean, at what point did someone start whispering in your ear, let's do a spin-off? Let's do Green Hornet or something else?
Green Hornet, Bill had talked about. And he was reluctant, first of all, to have me write it. I was too, because it would be exactly like Batman. I couldn't see any other way of doing it. And again, it was... I had a meeting with George Trendle, who was then very old, a guy who had originated the Green Hornet and the Lone Ranger in papers, in comic strips for Chicago years ago. And he was very proprietary about them still. It was an amazing meeting. Because at one point I said, why did the Green Hornet, I've forgotten what his name was, Britt Reed, I think. How did Britt Reed get into crime fighting? And Trendle looked at me as if I was mad. Don't you realize? He says, his uncle was the Lone Rider's nephew.
The Lone Ranger's nephew, you mean?
Excuse me, was the Lone Ranger's nephew. And he said he has a picture of him on his wall of his office. This is on radio. And I mean, this guy always it was very important to him not to explain things. He took it that seriously. And then it was decided, as I say, and the one person again who made it out of that was Bruce Lee. Bill there was no kung fu in it, it was karate. And Bill went up to San Francisco to look for a karate guy, kid who could play in it. And I remember he came back and said, forget karate, there's this thing better than that called kung fu. That was the first time anybody heard of that. And he said, and there's this fantastic kid that does it, Bruce Lee. Now, I mean, Bruce Lee became such a superstar. Bill was always sorry that he didn't sign him up.
But for Lone Ranger, excuse me, Green Hornet, this was at what part of the Batman phenomenon? Was it in the first season?
No, it
second?
Was sort of talked about in the second.
And essentially you're doing the same joke again, but with a different comic book character. Did you find a different way to approach it? I
didn't write it finally.
Oh, you didn't?
I didn't write it finally. I feel like, for various reasons, I wasn't that enthusiastic about doing the same thing again and whatnot.
But didn't you end up doing at least an episode of Green Hornet?
You tell me.
I think my notes say you did, but my notes also say you were in the Watergate break-in, so.
That's right. Well, now you're getting somewhere.
Yeah.
But I may have written one, but one early one, but I think I did. I seem to remember the show better than I would if I'd just seen it on the air, which I wouldn't have anyway.
So getting back to the Batman phenomenon, it's running twice a week. It's a big hit. Were you concerned that first season that you might be burning it up too fast, that it might not?
I wasn't concerned about it. I should have been. In fact, it did burn itself up too fast. Nobody knew in those days. This was pre-syndication and all those things. The huge amount of money to be made from a successful television show was not recognized by anybody. Dozier, nobody at Fox really realized it. So no effort was made, particularly to say, gee, we've got something here. It goes on 5 years, we'll all be rich, In which case it would have certainly restrained it, changed it, done something. The most they could do was bring in a bat cycle or something really dumb, as a change. I don't know if it could have been changed, but because it was a one-trick pony, basically.
At what point did someone say, let's do a movie, let's exploit this and make some money at the box office?
Okay. At some point, I don't know, whatever point, I guess it was in the second season, or towards the end of the second season, and the ratings were fading. And they had the idea of doing a movie. And
the idea was, what, to boost the TV ratings or just to get one last book out of?
I really think, I wasn't in on the discussions, but I think they didn't know. They had no idea at the time, some TV shows was pasting together episodes and calling it a movie with very poor results. The Man from U.N.C.L.E. did one. Mm-hmm. They put together, with a little bridging, 3 episodes and called it a feature. And I think a lot of people thought that the Batman feature, when it did come out, was made up of Batman episodes. They did not realize that it was a whole new. Actually, it was one of the best episodes, if I may say. It would have been, and so anyway, so Bill called me and said, they want to do a Batman movie, and I said, fine, I'll write it. And again, it was the same thing. I mean, I maybe talked with Bill. Maybe I never wrote a treatment or an outline. I just wrote it.
It must have been a thrill for you because you'd been wanting to get into movies for quite some time. Was it?
It was a thrill. It was a thrill, but it was a thrill. That's all. It was a thrill.
But were you a little reluctant that you wanted to break into movies and yet it's Batman? It was not a new thing. It was what you're doing already in TV.
To that extent, yes. In other words, it wasn't unbridled joy. It wasn't unbridled joy. But I mean, it was pleasure. But in fact, it worked out exactly that way. Because anyway, they made the movie. It was not a success. People saw it. And probably still, on DVDs and things, people still see it. But let me just digress for one moment. Interestingly, the Batman series has never been on DVD. And it'll be a huge seller. I mean, the actual Batman TV. And ever since, there's still a contractual war going on between Fox and the heirs to DC Comics, who owned it, about the merchandising and DVD rights. There was no contract in those days, and that's the only reason it hasn't been on. People always ask for it, and it is annoying me that the original ones should be out there in a box set. They put all these old shows on. Mm-hmm. This was a particular one that should be, but it's never been on DVD.
Well, speaking of the merchandising, at the time when Batman was a huge phenomenon, there were the lunch boxes, the toys, everything else. How did you feel about that? Did you have any of it?
No.
No?
See, I was very innocent, as you say. I really wasn't thinking. I was very happy-go-lucky, about that. I should have been, of course. But as I say, I didn't have my agent was still my friend, Peter, and I don't know, as I say, no, I didn't have any. It had never been in the contract in the beginning. It would have had to have been in the contract in the beginning. And we never thought it would come to that. It was very non-foresighted.
Now, you touched on earlier that the show got too campy and burned out too soon. Is that the only reason you think it didn't last longer? Why do you think the ratings fell off?
I think it was basically repetition. It really is, as I've said before, and you and other people suggested, it is a one-trick pony. It's the same joke over and over of one of these villains who always say, we're going to catch Batman. And they develop some murderous scheme, don't succeed, mm-hmm. and then he rounds them up. But they're there to come back another day if they seem to be good. And it really is not a very dramatic show. It really is a special type of high comedy show. I mean, and people began to come through more, that it wasn't really much of a dramatic show. And and also it was made quite cheaply. I don't know any figures, but certainly nothing. A lot was spared in those extras and those stuntmen and those fights. I won't say nothing was spared, but a lot was spared.
You mean the giant clam wasn't extraordinarily expensive?
I don't think so. I think at Wolfgang Puck's you could pay more for real clams probably than it was paid for that.
There was no effort to spin off Batgirl or try to capitalize?
Not particularly. Not particularly. I mean, again, I wasn't consulted if there had been. And
you mentioned earlier, you touched on the fact that your daughter is working in comedy today and Batman is revered. Why is it so, do you think, that it is still revered to this day, that people look back on it so fondly, that the joke hasn't waned?
I don't know if it was a good joke, and actually it hasn't been really done very well since that. I don't think there's been, it's okay. I don't think there's been that kind of sustained comedy show that passes off. It was unique, actually. Passes off as a dramatic series, but actually is comedy. And of a comedy of, as I say, a very high level. Verbal comedy, actually. You know, it's dialogue comedy in the situational comedy. And I don't know why, but these people, as I say, I'm talking about other writers. Mm-hmm. I went and picketed once at the recent writers' strike. I can't walk very well, otherwise I seem to have my marbles and everything. But so we rented a wheelchair. I got in, I had Maria, my daughter, who's a writer and guild member, pushing me in it. The idea being that you know, it would be a good photo op. We hope we get somebody at the time, somebody to take a picture of it. It was too crowded, they didn't. But a couple of people came up to me, other writers, who didn't know me. Somebody said, that's Lorenzo Semple over there. And they said, I've been wanting to meet you for years just because of that, Batman things. And I was wearing wearing a cap that was 50th anniversary of D-Day was on it that somebody had given me. I wasn't on D-Day, I was there a week or so later. But some lady came up to me and said, there I was in a wheelchair, being pushed in a wheelchair at the strike, and they said, and you were in the invasion too? And I said, well, yes. And she said, God bless you, sir. Which made me feel really...
Batman and the Invasion, what more could you do
exactly,
in one lifetime?
But God bless you, sir. That made me feel really ancient. Unlike one time, shortly before that, I'd been driving a Mustang down right a few blocks from here, Mustang in the rain with the top down, a drizzle. And a guy pulled up alongside me, a young kid in a car, and said, hardcore, dude. That to me was the most opposite from God bless you, sir. And that was a great pleasure to me.
Now, unlike a lot of other people on Batman, you not only weren't typed by the show, you didn't try to repeat it. I know Charles Fitzsimons went on and did Wonder Woman. I think Bill Dozer tried to do Dick Tracy. And Adam West never got out from under the shadow. How were you able not to be typecasted by the Batman phenomenon?
Because after the movie came out, again, in my usual way, there were no meetings. I don't think I even told them what the idea was. I mean, what the gimmick was. It was not, as I remember, that all the villains had gotten together. They were going to dehydrate the members of the dust, the members of the Security Council. I mean, that was their scheme. I may have said I've got something like that, but there was no outline. It had been too absurd. It was a series of little sketches. Always they were. And anyway, I wrote the movie instantly, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, in Westport, and sent it to them. And as I told you, it was done immediately. And the director of that one had also brought it in under budget even. And he's not the sort of person who ever got an Oscar for directing, let me say.
Do you remember who it was?
Yes, but I don't want to knock him or anything. He's and anyway, so Fox thought nothing to do with Batman or television. There was a comic book called Modesty Blaze, a character that was quite successful in Europe, particularly in England. They made a movie, and in Italy and places it was a big selling comic. So Fox bought a book called Fathom, which they wanted to they thought that Fathom could be fashioned into a modesty blaze. She was 6 feet tall. That's the name of the book. And so they wanted to make a movie called Fathom, making a kind of a more James Bondy type. So anyway, so they called me to write it. I was called to write it because Batman, I'd done it so fast, cheap, and the director had brought it in under budget, so they would use the same team. And so I came, at this point, I'd finally come out to Hollywood and was living in a house we rented, Boris Karloff's old house. It had nice vibes. And so I started the script, making it up as I went along.
Right.
And I wrote about 20 very good pages. It's easy to write 20 good pages if you don't have to bother about what's going to happen next. I made every page exciting. And I sent it out to Fox. David Brown was the story editor. Dick Zanuck was the boss then. And they liked it a lot. So they said, come on out. They said, there's a guy here on the lot who we have a deal with, a producer, also a writer. And so we're going to let him produce it because we owe John a job. You know, it's a gig. So and they said, I came out there and I said, now you talk to John about this. But he said,
what was his last name? John?
He's dead now. Again, I don't. He was a good friend of mine, John Cohn. And they said, remember, you were the writer. We hired you to write, and you're the writer. And John is going to be the producer, and, you know, have some ideas, but he's the writer. So I went in to meet John. And John said, these are wonderful pages. They said, what happens next? I said, I have no idea. So John said, well, let's throw them away and start from scratch. You and I will write it together. And I was sufficiently awed. I said, fine. You know, I said, fine. I mean, I'd never been in a studio before. I mean, in a movie studio, really. And, you know, hired to write a real movie.
You didn't think of Batman as a real movie?
No, it was a spin-off. This was a self-standing movie based on a book. Batman was part of the series, as far as I was concerned. And as far as anybody else was concerned, too, they never exploited it much. They didn't know. It just was a thing to get a few extra bucks. They didn't. It's not like these days where they want to see if they have a property that can be mined in different ways, you know, theatrically and et cetera, et cetera. Nobody paid much attention to it. I think they were glad that it was made cheap and on budget, and that was it. So anyway, so John said, let's write it together. And even though we became very good friends, it was not a good collaboration. John would sit at the typewriter. I would say a line. He'd say, nobody would say that. And so he'd suggest a line. I would say, honestly, I can't see any human being saying that. And then we would compromise. And so we'd finally find a line that both of us thought somebody could say. This is not the way that great scripts are written. And they hired Raquel Welch to do it. And she won't even list it in her filmography. She's so ashamed of it. And she and the director had a fight on the first day. And she never spoke to him again for the rest of the shooting. And the picture's not good. I saw it recently. I mean, I found a tape of it. In fact, to my amazement, I found it on DVD. And when people, the old line was joke when people say, oh, I saw Fathom. The answer was, what's the matter? Didn't they give you a parachute? Because it was only shown on airplanes. And that's a line used about many movies.
But it's pretty incredible. You did this show, Batman.
Yeah.
I would think, even though the show burned out after 2 seasons, it was still a phenomenon that reshaped TV. Wasn't the TV industry, in a sense, opening their doors to you, saying, Lorenzo, what's next for you? What's your next series? We want it.
I really blame it on lack of representation. And also, I wasn't really, honestly. I don't know. Nobody ever did.
You weren't even yourself interested in exploiting? You didn't have the taste for TV after Batman?
I never had a particular taste for TV. I'm not a big, it's gotten infinitely better now. But, for what? I've never been a fan of episodic series in general. I'm not ashamed to say, but I know a lot of them are very good. And I keep meaning to watch them. And I watched 2 or 3 episodes, and then I TiVo them, and I haven't watched them yet.
But you were, just to make sure I'm clear, you were on Batman from the pilot to the last episode. You were there all the way through, rewriting the scripts.
Yeah. I had an office there, and I was in there, and I...
So you actually finally, you came in from Spain, you got as far as Westport, but they must have lured you west of the Mississippi at some point.
Yeah, after a few more shows, they said, really, because there was still, I had a phone there, but they wanted, we had a producer there, Howie Horwitz at that time, he was a nice guy, killed in an accident up in Mammoth. Howie was producing and overseeing it. It had more of a structure then.
Uh-huh.
And so there would be, people would want rewrites for production reasons and to do with the star and stuff beyond me, and I'd do them, but it was less and less my creation in my mind. Especially these, I thought, ridiculous villains. They weren't terribly funny, and they certainly didn't lend themselves to any sort of drama. I thought they were too over the top. And so, I had less interest in it. I did it still, but I didn't feel it was really my Batman.
Well, once you were here on the lot and making production rewrites and that sort of thing for Batman, did you then begin interacting more with the actors and going to the set, and even though it was right there across the lot?
It wasn't actually, yeah. We shot at various places. We shot at that one down in, there was a Selznick place down in Culver City, various places. No, I didn't go to them.
Was that unusual for someone in your position at that time?
Ask somebody in my position at that time. I say again, I wanted to write movies more. And so, I really wasn't, I didn't get very involved.
Well,
I probably should have. I felt about some of my movies that way too. In other words, I am not interested so much. I love writing them, and I'm not perfect, but you see them in your mind as you write them, and no, on two of the big movies that I'm known for, 3 Days of the Condor and Parallax View, I was replaced as a writer. I was fired towards the end when they wanted to bring in somebody else to do something. And it never bothered me particularly at all. They figured that they just wanted new blood, new ideas. And or the director, in one of them with 3 Days of the Condor, Redford always had David Rayfield, a very good writer. He wrote all Redford's movies, credited or not. And Sidney directed them. And so everybody knew from the beginning they were going to bring in David Rayfield at some point.
Hadn't you worked with David Rayfield before on one of your...
No.
Well, backing up a little bit, you've come off of Batman. You've done the Batman feature, which is known for camp and satire. You'd think that after that, you'd be typed as a campy, especially if you throw Fathom into the mix. And yet you were able to score gigs like Papillon, which is hardly in the same genre as Batman. How were you able to reimagine yourself in Hollywood as a writer after Batman?
I did Fathom, and then what followed Fathom?
Pretty Poison?
Pretty Poison, thank you. Yes, Pretty Poison, which is one of my 2 outstanding cult classics. They're both cult classics, Flash Gordon and Pretty Poison. The first requirement of a cult classic is that nobody goes to it when it's shown in the theater. And then, for that reason, critics vastly overpraise it, sort of to bash the studios. Good critics. I'm not talking about reviewers who give them thumbs up or down. I'm talking about critics. And that happened again. It's not really for this interview, but that happened with Pretty Poison. Mm-hmm. It was Fox hated it so that they showed it only they opened it with no press screening at one theater in Upper West Side, New York. And Pauline Kael, who was a friend of mine, independently, Pauline said, let's go see, he called up Joe Morgenstern, the critic for the Wall Street Journal, and said, let's go see what movie is so bad that Fox doesn't dare show it to anybody. Just to write an article, bash Fox. And they loved the movie. Not as much. They thought it was a really good movie. Mm-hmm. And so they wrote extravagant praise of it. Must see, a classic, etc., which it wasn't. And then I won the thanks to Pauline, I won the New York Film Critics Award for the best screenplay of the year because of that. But my wife said to Pauline, thanks for getting, you got Lorenzo that award. She said, damn right I did. She just liked manipulating people, the other critics and things. But there was a sort of a deadlock between other real better movies. But the movie's always been greatly honored for that reason. It's as I say, it's a
And
classic.
that got you Papillon? How'd you end up giving me something as heavy as Papillon?
Well,
after?
I got, actually that led, not directly, but Dino De Laurentiis had actually, people don't realize, Dino was the one who bought 3 Days of the Condor, the book. And the movie opens, for people who don't remember it, I mean, it opens very simply. The guy goes out to lunch, Robert Redford goes out to lunch, he works in this very dreary CIA place reading books. He comes back and everybody in the office has been machine gunned. Now that is an opening that Dino would adore. Anybody should love that opening. I mean, you can't get a better teaser for a movie. You come back from lunch and everybody's dead. And so anyway, I got to know Dino on that. And Dino wanted me to write, he had an idea for doing a sequel to Barbarella, which Jane Fonda said she wouldn't be caught dead doing it, incidentally. But it also was to be called Barbarella Goes Down, was Dino's brilliant title. It was to take place underwater. It never got anywhere. So Dino, anyway, proposed me to write 3 Days of the Condor,
Right.
which I did. I say I was replaced by David Rayfield. And Sidney Pollack and I also had some disagreements about the ending of the movie, what the plot should be. Won't go into now. Guess what? His version was done. His and Redford's version was done. And so that led to, after that, my then agent, and wonderful agent, Everett Ziegler, now deceased also, the best, he represented Bill Goldman and all kinds of, he was the class act of agents. And the publishers, Doubleday, made a deal with him to get movies made out of novels of theirs that hadn't sold, small novels, not bestsellers, but that had good plot possibilities. So The Parallax View was one of those novels. And Ziggy and I talked about it. We went around and pitched the book a bit, but couldn't sell it. And then I wrote, on spec, I wrote the script. And Ziggy managed to sell it. Let me say, we sold it anyway to, it was really sold at, not Alan Pakula, it was sold to Beatty, Warren Beatty, by William Morris. And he brought in Alan Pakula. And I have to go back 1 month or two.
Actually, why don't we pause? We'll pick it up on the next reel.